Chapter 52. Paris 2. The blood and carnage was nauseating. The bodies of brave knights were minced into pieces beneath rains of arrows and the ballistic balls of destructive cannons. Their mad roars filled the skies as they charged toward their deaths. They seemed to be filled with courage and a sacrificial will. It was the kind of thing that brought a man and his family honor in any era. But Lionel just found the scene to be sad to look upon. What were they fighting for? Their country, of course. Maybe on a deeper layer it was for their god. But was it worth it? Lionel wasn't the kind of person who looked down on others for their faith. He was questioning more so if their god even wanted this. Lionel shook his head. It isn't that they believe their god wants this. It's that they're being manipulated into believing so by those they trust the most. Before this, Lionel still had a hard time blaming Joan. Even though her actions almost led to his death, he had always been a forgiving person. Since he was still standing here, there was no harm, right? In that case, there was still a chance at mending their friendship. Many would call this sort of mentality foolish, and if they did, Leon wouldn't argue with them. He too found it to be foolish. But this was just his nature. However, after seeing this scene, the last wisp of understanding he had for Joan vanished. Whatever reasons, she had no longer mattered to him. She knew how devastating her actions would be, yet she carried them out anyway. How many innocent people would die today? A few thousand? More than that? Lionel had always heard that the wars of the past were child's play compared to wars during and following World War I. But even if these death counts couldn't compare to the millions who lost their lives during those Pyrrhic monstrosities, reading numbers from a textbook and witnessing it for yourself were two completely different experiences. It was unforgivable. I can't keep letting them die like this while I do nothing but stand here and watch. Nay. Aina. Lionel looked over with an apologetic smile at the dainty fairy that stood by his side. She was much different from the Aina that always been in his heart. She wasn't wearing her usual long flowing dress, the kind that clung to her curves with the slightest gust of wind. Instead, she wore a black military uniform densely packed with pockets. Her hair wasn't as perfectly groomed, gently waving like the descent of a calm waterfall. Instead, it was quite tangled. Some of it even stuck to her delicate face with the help of her beads of sweat. Even her usual elegant demeanor was nowhere to be seen. The massive, murderous axe on her back was too good at crushing such thoughts. However, Lionel found that he liked her even more now than he had in the past. Maybe it couldn't even be simply explained as like anymore, even if he wasn't sure how to express it. All he could say was that the way Aina looked simply didn't matter to him anymore. I've already said it. Aina said calmly without looking in his direction. Don't change. Her words seemed to have nothing to do with the situation. Even Lionel was confused by what she was saying. When had she? Lionel's gaze flashed with a bit of realization, and he looked away from Aina's side profile and looked back toward the violent battle. Aina. Hearing Lionel's voice, Aina trembled slightly. She knew well that Lionel had an exceptionally kind side to him, but there was another side that was full of resolve. It was that side of him that stood in battle against thousands of Englishmen and refused to let her go. It was that side this voice was from. Me. I don't know enough about the relationship between you and your family, but I do know that you've been avoiding me due to it. However, Lionel grinned wildly. You just said it yourself. You asked me not to change. So you tell me, do you think I would let the woman I like face such a thing on her own? Or is it that my Aina wants to take back her words? Aina was stunned stiff. Lionel had confessed to her 521 times. She didn't need anyone to keep count for her. She knew the number herself. She should have gotten used to it by now. However, it had been over a year now since the last time she had heard him say such things. She had almost forgotten how it felt. A moment later, her face flushed a blazing shade of red. It seemed like she would leak a fountain of blood if she was poked just once. Usually she would run away, but where would she run now? She couldn't leave Lionel behind in such a dangerous situation. After a while, she was so stifled that she stomped her foot against the ground, causing it to tremble and crack. Lionel's lip twitched. He had almost forgotten that this petite fairy before him was such a monster. Taking a deep breath, Lionel looked back toward the battlefield, and those fluttering emotions in his heart faded. He knew how foolish his next actions would be. Originally, he should have waited for maybe even a few days of battle to pass by. Only then would both sides be damaged enough for his plan to work perfectly. But he just couldn't stand by and watch these valiant men die while he knew they were just puppets on the strings of another. If he really did allow them to suffer for his own designs, how would he be any different from Joan? "Let's go." Lionel shot forward Aina, who had regained her composure, following closely behind him. In an instant, they had arrived on the battlefield and were immediately noticed by Joan and the two men on the castle walls, causing all three of their expressions to change violently. In what seemed like a flash, Lionel and Aina crossed the defensive line of the tall wooden towers, entering a no-man's land filled with French corpses. "For France!" Lionel roared as countless arrows rained down toward him. His left arm flicked upward, causing his small shield to explode in size. Before it, the rain of arrows was no different from harmless water droplets. Both he and Aina were completely unharmed. In the blink of an eye, two unknowns had made it to the city walls. "Aina!" Aina nodded and pulled her massive axe back while taking a rope from one of her pockets with a free hand. Lionel leapt into the air. He didn't need to look back to feel the violent winds of Aina's axe slamming toward him. But she obviously wasn't attacking him. The flat of her blade boomed against the soles of his feet as she tossed the rope in her opposite hand into the air. Under the shocked gazes of the two armies, Lionel made it to the top of the castle and swung his massive shield, sending tens of Englishmen flying. He looked back, finding the rope Aina had thrown up snaking through the skies and grabbing it without hesitation. He grasped it with both hands and pulled up with all his might, sending her to the top of the wall with one swift motion. Lionel retracted his shield and pulled his spear from his back and brandished it against his body with one arm. He felt Aina's delicate back press against his own as she brandished her own weapon. Like this, the two faced swaths of enemies on both sides. Yet, Lionel's handsome face carried a wild grin, while Aina's beautiful lips curled into a slight smile. A rare moment of silence descended onto the battlefield before the roaring cheers of the French resounded. Chapter 53. Paris. 3. Despite the cheers of the French, Joan's golden helm hid an unsightly expression. If she wasn't certain before that Lionel's goal differed from her own, she was now. In truth, even if he did this, it shouldn't have been so obvious so quickly. However, Lionel only had himself to blame once more. The reason Joan was able to realize there was something wrong with his actions was because of those words he spoke to her in English that day. Nigel and Raymond simultaneously turned their gazes toward Joan as though trying to gain an explanation. But what they found in return was her warped expression, making the answer to their question quite obvious. These two weren't one of them. On the castle walls, Lionel and Aina stood back to back, facing enemies on all sides. From front to back, the walls averaged almost 10 meters in thickness, so the number of knights and archers here was definitely not just a few. In addition, since there was so much space, the pair didn't gain any advantage due to the landscape. However, Lionel and Aina both took a strong step forward. Though it wasn't enough to shake the massive castle walls, the loud boom was enough for the warriors around them to look on in shock. Before they could react, tens more fell from the high walls. This was only the first day of the siege. Or, rather, it really should have been the first of many days. As a result, most of the warriors on the castle walls were archers. Though there were some knights, they weren't high in number. With this, it became very obvious very quickly just how disadvantaged they were. Aina and Lionel swept through them as though adults playing with children. The fear-filled Englishmen were so shocked by the sudden shift in the battle that they didn't even realize that though many of them were being heavily injured, the majority of them hadn't even died. "What's their—" Nigel was confused. What exactly were they trying to do? However, it was at that moment his expression changed. "The gates! Stop them!" He pulled up his long bow and was about to use it, but then his expression became unsightly. There was only a distance, maybe 20 meters, between him and Lionel, a distance that practically meant death to anyone who offended an archer like him. The problem was that there were clusters of Englishmen in his way. There was no clear path for his shot. Lionel might have been a kind-hearted soul who often did foolish things for the sake of his moral code. However, he wasn't a fool. He had guessed that Joan and these two men with abilities were working together. And he guessed that if he and Aina just suddenly appeared, they wouldn't have time to communicate between themselves to understand what was going on. As a result, they wouldn't be able to stop them from getting to the top of the walls. And if they couldn't do that, then the path to the gates would be too easy to reach. Lionel jumped up and onto the edge of the wall, sprinting along it at a speed that surpassed the human body. There was no shortage of those who tried to push him off or knock him off balance, but his coordination stat had reached a level far beyond anything these soldiers could imagine. "Charge toward the gates!" Lionel roared. His voice blanketed the battlefield, suppressing the cheering of the Frenchmen who immediately regained their senses. That was right. They were still in the middle of a war. Lionel and Aina had caused the archers to become completely disorganized on an entire segment of the wall. Even if there were more parts left unscathed, it was still a huge pressure off of them, especially since the part of the wall now unable to send attacks toward them was exactly the part that protected the drawbridge gates. For a moment, it seemed as though Lionel had become their commander and many forgot that they still had to wait for Joan's order. Maybe it was the confidence in Lionel's tone or the fact he was very much used to leading groups of men, or maybe it was that they all had taken a liking to him in the past few months, but they completely disregarded everything and charged forward like madmen. Seeing this, Joan's visage darkened even further. This was completely out of her control. What could she do? Tell them to come back? What kind of blow would that strike them? All this time she had never forgotten that she was a woman. In modern times, this wouldn't matter too much. But in this era, it already took her several years of godlike feats to gain the acknowledgement of these men. She was very much aware that even a single mistake could cause everything she had worked for to come crumbling down. Lionel's lip curled as he leaped onto a defensive tower, dodging the sword of a defending knight and kicking him away. He shot forward and down a set of winding stairs. Castles were designed with defense in mind. Even something as simple as stairs kept this in mind. They made it difficult to use your dominant hand to wield your weapon, and even had irregularly shaped steps that promoted losing your foothold. But, before Lionel's coordination stat, none of it seemed to matter at all. It wasn't long before he made it to the gear room, finding the large chains that held up the drawbridge dangling before him. Unfortunately, he also found something else. Raimond stood before Lionel with a curious expression, blocking the way to the chains. By his side, there were a group of 10 silver-armored knights, looking toward Lionel with dull expressions. 3 of them wielded longbows, 4 were spearmen, and 3 were swordsmen. I thought that something out of expectation would happen today, but I didn't expect it to be this. Who are you two? Where are you from? Have you not considered the reaction of the bishop? To Lionel's back, Aina blocked the constant flow of knights and warriors. Considering how narrow the passageway was, it didn't put any pressure on her at all, but her eyes still narrowed at Raimond's words. Lionel surprisingly didn't waste any words, completely out of Raimond's expectations. With one swift motion, he tossed his spear into the air, allowing it to spin. His freed hand pulled out his atlatl and a dart, hooking it as he took a strong step forward. Lionel's force surged, his eyes turning to a bright green glow that caused Raimond's eyes to widen. You... Raimond's words had barely formed when a violent surge of wind sent his helmet flying. He could only barely see the streak of silver as it cut through the air, its destination the very chains Raimond had thought to protect. Like a knife through butter, Lionel's dart sliced through the thick chains. How could the forging of the 1400s match up to a spear created by higher dimensional beings? The sounds of rattling and accelerating chains resounded as the roars of the French continuously became louder. Lionel holstered his atlatl and caught his spinning spear before it fell, pointing it toward the group. Come, what? Chapter 54, Paris. Lionel hid his trembling left arm to his side, holding it against his body firmly to make its odd movement less obvious. After he forcefully stimulated his force, the force chains that had been snaking from the force art on his hand took the opportunity to counter. In the end, Lionel had to forcefully suppress it, but the result was a drain that was even a level higher than it had been in the past. Aina didn't know it, but Lionel hadn't even been able to sleep in the last several days. If he stopped suppressing it for even a moment, he would suffer. Luckily, he could enter a meditative state that allowed his mind to rest while remaining alert, or else he might not even be able to continue standing now. This was the true reason Lionel so confidently pointed his spear toward Raymond and the others. He wasn't some sort of battle maniac. Those words were definitely out of character for him. But he had no choice. He had to do his best to hide his current weakness. And it seemed like it worked. The pressure that Lionel emitted, coupled with the roars of the charging French, made the Englishmen to Raymond's back feel that they might really be finished. To one side there was Aina, who killed knights descending the narrow winding stairs with a single swing of her axe. Before them there was Lionel, whose hair whipped about in a wild manner as his momentum grew. And to their backs, thousands of the French were crossing the no-man's land they had created toward the castle they were defending. Even for Raymond, he really couldn't think of a way out of this. The plan wasn't even a tenth of the way to completion. His calm expression flickered several times, running through a marathon of emotions. In the end, his visage twisted, landing on anger. Who were these two? They had planned for so long and so diligently, giving away years of their lives toward this goal. Yet it was going to be finished just like this. How could he be willing? After a deep breath, he calmed down. Barely a few seconds had passed since Lionel caused the drawbridge to fall. It wasn't over yet. There was still time to turn this around. No, maybe this was an even better outcome for the original plan. At that moment, etchings on the ground Lionel hadn't taken notice of flashed, and the group of 11 vanished. Lionel's gaze landed on the etchings for only a moment before coming to an understanding. Force Art, DE. A teleportation, Force Art, die. It was no wonder they managed to just appear here before Lionel finished descending the stairs. Is the man with the Force Art ability among them? Lionel thought to himself. Lionel suddenly felt a hand clamp down on his trembling left arm. He looked down to find Aina looking toward him with a mixture of worry and anger on her face. What are you hiding from me? Lionel opened his mouth to respond, but he really didn't know what to say. He had only wanted to deal with the chains as quickly as possible. The longer he took, the more Frenchmen would die. But he hadn't expected the backlash to be so bad. Luckily, he didn't have to face Aina's questioning glares any longer because the first group of Frenchmen begun crossing the moat. Lionel took that opportunity to look toward inner gates. Taking a deep breath, he could only look toward Aina with a pleading expression as though asking her not to say any more. Aina flicked Lionel's arm down in anger and glared at him as though trying to boil him alive with nothing but her eyes. Then she turned in a huff of rage, her axe lighting up with a violent red glow. She unleashed all her emotions onto the gate, slicing it cleanly in half and kicking its lower portion with a wind-screeching stomp. The doors were sent flying, taking with them the lineup of archers that had been waiting on the other side to start another bloody slaughter. Lionel's lip twitched. He really had to remember to stop making this woman angry. Suddenly, his expression changed. Lionel stomped his foot on the ground hard, barreling forward with all his might and appearing to Aina's side. He grabbed her waist, lifting his trembling left arm to block with his quickly expanding shield. The two of them were blasted backward, sliding along the ground on their feet, almost to the point of crashing into the French vanguard. The force chains had taken advantage of the moment to snake further up Lionel's arm, almost causing him to lose control of it. Had that happened, he didn't even want to think of the consequences. Lionel turned a narrowed gaze toward Nigel, who was slowly lowering his bow from the other side of the inner gates, and then a solemn one toward his now severely dented shield. All this time, no one had been able to land even a single scratch on it. But now it was deformed to the point its shape almost broke his arm. A little bit more and really could have. That arrow really was too swift and too powerful. Had it not been for his ability improving and causing his senses to reach an unprecedented level, he might have been too late. At that moment, Lionel felt a bundle of raging force to his side. He looked in shock toward Aina, who seemed on the verge of exploding from anger. Aina! Aina! Aina was stunned out of her berserk state. The combination of Lionel's troubles and the near-death experience almost made her lose her mind again, but luckily, Lionel caught her at the start this time. Lionel looked back toward Nigel, a deep frown setting into his brow. The situation had changed once more. Raymond and his 10 knights had appeared, followed by a female wearing a golden mask appeared with her own knights. Each of the female's knights wore helms that revealed nothing but the slits of their eyes. Englishmen continuously poured in from all sides, forming a defensive line to block entry to the inner gates. It wasn't long before their numbers totaled in the hundreds. Lionel's gaze, however, didn't leave the golden-masked woman. Though the pole she held in her hand no longer had a flag on it, Lionel wasn't a fool. This woman was obviously Joan. The charging Frenchmen, as though by a previous tacit agreement, slowly organized themselves to Lionel and Ina's backs. Lionel whined in the trembling of his left arm. He finally felt he could use his force again without becoming a puppet to this mysterious person. Since Joan was standing firmly on the enemy's side, there really was nothing more to say. Lionel didn't want to spare any words on such a person. He only wanted to ask just what was the purpose of all of this. It didn't seem to make any coherent sense at all. What was the point of this battle? Why fight on the side of the French at all if her goal was to lose? And at this point, why did she even care to continue to hide her identity? Lionel closed his eyes and shook his head, releasing Ina. None of it mattered anymore. Today would be the end of Joan's legend. Ina.A. Ina flicked her palm upward, causing a perfectly square plank of wood to appear. She used the same force technique that helped her levitate her massive axe to allow it to hover in the air. Lionel's gaze flashed with seriousness as his spear snaked forward. In the blink of an eye, an intricate rune with soft edges reminiscent to low ocean tides appeared on the wood. With a final strike of Lionel's spear, the plank of wood shot forward through the sliced inner gates. At first, it seemed like nothing would happen. It was just an ordinary piece of wood flying through the air. However, it was then the temperature began to rise. A moment later, the plank of wood burst into a fire that raced through the lines of the rune. And in the next instant of time, it collapsed before violently expanding into a fireball just over a meter in diameter. Nigel, Raymond and Joan's eyes widened in horror. Chapter 55, Paris 5. Bonus chapter for 200 Power Stones. Next at 400. The three of them were shocked and horrified, but Lionel and Ina had already acted once again. In as little as 3 breaths of time, 3 more planks of wood were flying toward them, scorching the air. Finally, Joan reacted. With a wave of her pole, her knights stepped forward and stomped their feet as one. Golden strings sprung from her flagless polearm, attaching to the heads of each of the knights and causing their auras to skyrocket. A moment later, a thin and pale gold dome-like shield appeared in the path of the first fireball. Bang! The barrier shook and cracked, on the verge of collapse. Nigel quickly reacted, pulling his bow string and releasing 3 arrows that seemed to magically manifest in rapid succession. The embers of the first fireball flashed and sprinkled down from the air. Soon becoming a curtain, the 3 energy arrows pierced through to collide with the next 3 balls of fire. Let's go! Leon broke out into a run before the 6 attacks even collided. 80% chance he uses the collision as cover for another energy attack. Shield. Lionel's ears twitched, barely catching Raymond's words beneath the next cacophony of booms. The latter was practically whispering. If it wasn't for Lionel's sharp sense, he would have really missed it. Precognition? Prediction? Psychic? Lionel frowned. However, his steps didn't stop. Judging by the situation, this person seemed to think that Lionel wouldn't be able to hear him. Another thing was that he didn't have a method of communicating without speaking. As long as Leon could continue applying pressure on him, even if he could guess his most likely course of action, he would only be able to take the optimal actions for himself. In that case, the impact of his ability would be severely limited. Lionel's force surged, pressing down on his left arm with the pressure of a mountain. It would be difficult to win this battle without his force. However, Lionel Morales. Strength, 0.99. Speed, 0.99, plus 0.1. Agility, 0.9, plus 0.1. Partially nullified. Coordination, 1.15. Stamina, 0.991.2, plus 0.9. Spirit, 1. Force, 0.5. Lionel felt that this was enough. Ina cut past Lionel, swinging her massive shimmering axe down and causing a beam of force to split the explosion in half. Lionel took the opportunity of the pause in her steps to flash by her once more, jumping through the opening she created. Seeing this, Raymond smiled, believing he had successfully predicted Lionel's attack pattern. However, he soon realized that he had miscalculated. Seemingly having expected the new barrier in his wake, Lionel took appropriate action. The movement of Joan's knights are based on her ability. However, as expected, the movements of Raymond's are more autonomous. They exist for the sole purpose of protecting him, and any combination abilities they have should rely on force arts. Yada. Ina.in. Ina was already following closely behind. Hearing Lionel's voice, she flung forward another plank of wood. Force arts can create, but they can also destroy. If he could use his force, this barrier would be nothing to him, especially since it had already blocked a percentage of Aina's energy scythe. However, he wasn't certain that his bodily strength alone could pull it off. Luckily, it didn't have to. Lionel's eyes rapidly shifted from side to side, taking in everything about the barrier he was still leaping toward. His ability churned at full tilt, calculating madly without end. In the next instant, a familiar square plank of wood appeared before him, and his spear snaked forward once again without hesitation. Undo! There were many disciplines under the force art umbrella. In fact, it was even a bit foolish to consider them a single whole. Among these disciplines, there were a few greatly respected. Those that followed this discipline were known as decryptionists. They had the ability to deconstruct any force art and see through their flaws. Those of this profession were invaluable in high-level zones, and when exploring the graves of high-grade dimensional masters. Of course, Lionel wasn't such a person. It was just that he happened to realize that force art was simply a method of making force flow in a certain manner. Specific frequencies and conditions allow the manifestation of different phenomena. But in that case, couldn't those frequencies be countered? It was a simple thought that Lionel had tested in the last few days. Even he wasn't aware of just how unfathomable the path he had stepped onto was, nor was Raymond aware that he would be the first to suffer under his discovery. In a muffled bang, the defensive barrier formed by Raymond's knights collapsed like a house of cards, allowing Lionel and Aina to charge through. Before the first knight could react, Lionel's spear shot forward with an unbelievable speed and pierced his throat. He pulled it back and passed by before the first spurt of blood even made itself known. Nigel cocked back another arrow, but before it made it to Lionel, Aina had already stepped forward. With a swing of her axe, the arrow shattered like glass. Without missing a beat, Lionel's spear became like a blur, causing another 3 knights to fall mercilessly. No matter how much armor they wore, he was able to find the tiniest crevices and the smallest openings to exploit, reaping their lives with a single strike every time. Joan couldn't sit idly by. With another wave of her polearm, her knights moved forward once more. Lionel had thought that they would be just as easy to deal with as Raymond's knights. However, he soon found that even after several probes, both his and Aina were still trapped in their encirclement. Every time Lionel thought he saw an opportunity to strike one of them down, another would strike toward him at an angle he had no choice but to retreat from. After this happened several times, Lionel's expression grew solemn. They share their senses. Lionel's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected their momentum to be stifled so suddenly. The only way to break through in a short time is... Well, absolute power. Lionel's gaze narrowed and he shot forward. Others might think that the only method of displaying absolute power was strength. But Lionel knew of another, speed. 90% chance he tries to brute force his way through. Raymond's voice once again traveled to Lionel's ear. His words were incredibly soft, and he believed that only Joan could hear him, but the reality wasn't so. Joan waved her polearm once again, causing her knights to bunch together in preparation for a strong attack. Unfortunately, though Raymond's prediction was correct, he failed to describe the method Lionel would use. Lionel firmly planted a leg, suddenly changing directions and shooting through a gap between a knight and the inner gate. Joan's actions had only made them all the more susceptible to his maneuver. Call the window. The instant Lionel flashed through, a faint glow coated the tip of his spear. Raymond's last thought was one filled with shock. He, who could do the work of God and prophesy the future, died just like this. A bloody hole seeped with blood from his forehead, even as a sweep of Aina's axe sent Joan's knights tumbling back several steps. Lionel clenched his jaw, the veins on his left hand bulging like swarming green snakes beneath his dented shield. He had gotten rid of the most dangerous of the 3 of them, but he had paid a severe price. He couldn't move his left arm,